This is a panel on how to protect the divisions of power as the foundation of democracy, and that is sorely needed as that is under attack in many countries, including my home country of the United States of America. As we speak, that is in the news that the President Trump might or might not listen to the courts, which is a circumstance that was previously unimaginable. So now I want to present to you several keynote speakers, and then we'll have panelists join us and start the conversation. But first up is Richard Goldstone. He's the chair of the United Nations fact-finding mission on Gaza conflict, prosecutor of war crimes in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, leading the ICTY and the ICTR.
Thank you very much, and thank you for attending our session. I want to talk a little bit about the rule of law and its core requirement that there should be an independent judiciary to protect the division of powers. In his report in August of 2004 to the Security Council, the then Secretary General Kofi Annan referred to the rule of law as being at the very heart of the organization's mission. He said it refers to a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions and entities, public and private, and I emphasize, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. This was an important statement coming from the Secretary General. It's in this context that one of the essential ingredients of democracy that is too frequently overlooked, and I mention this very much in passing, but it's important, and that is the protection of minorities and marginalized groups. In too many democracies, and there are too many Democrats who suggest that the Constitution is a document to empower government rather than a brake on the misuse of majority rule. When rights, and especially human rights, come into conflict with each other or are not respected, it is an independent judiciary that is the only organ of state able to intervene. The equal treatment of all under the law is not possible without an independent and unbiased judiciary to interpret and apply the law. This self-evident truth was recognized in 1945 in Article 10 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and has been recognized in virtually all regional human rights conventions. What I've said thus far is really, I think, common cause for all democratic lawyers and politicians. Let me turn to the manner in which judges are appointed. It's crucial to their independence and impartiality, whether in fact or perception. There is a political dimension to the appointment of judges that cannot be avoided. It's often overlooked, but it's particularly important that the elected representatives of the people should be involved in the selection of judges. Unelected judges are called upon to determine the legality of legislation passed by the elected representatives of the people. There's an obvious political tension in this situation, and it's imperative that the decisions of judges be respected by the majority of the electorate. So too, it is equally important that those decisions be respected by the legislature. When I say that they should be respected, I do not mean that they should reflect the views of the majority or of the legislature. Whatever, they must be accepted and implemented. It is too frequently overlooked that this political dimension needs to be reflected in the method by which judges are appointed. There's no universal method of democratic appointment of judges. In some countries, like the United States, it is highly politicized, in my view, too politicized. The President nominates and the Senate has to endorse the appointments. In my country and others, in South Africa, an independent Judicial Service Commission recommends the names of appointees to our courts to the President. The Commission consists of representatives of both the legislative and executive branches of government, as well as representatives of the legal profession and civil society. This has by and large marginalized the politicization of appointments. Very few people in South Africa will know whether Judge X or Y was appointed by this president or that president. The perception of the judge's independence has become more problematic in a number of democracies by reason of the polarized nature of their societies. In the United States and some European countries, that polarization has weakened the independence of judges. I wrote this 2 days ago. I said it is disturbing that in the United States the question is today seriously raised as to whether there is a prospect of the Trump administration refusing to be bound by all judicial decisions. That's out of date. The Trump administration has in fact made it very clear that it is not respecting the decision taken with regard to the expulsion of some immigrants to the United States. And I said the very fact that the question is debated and considered indicates a deep malaise in the United States society. In summary, there is no fail-safe method by which judges are appointed only on merit and without regard to their political affiliations or loyalties. The more public the method of appointment, the less the likelihood that political appointments will be made. Most judicial appointment commissions do provide for the public nomination of judges and for the question of nominees at a public hearing. Judicial independence is also reinforced by the accountability of judges. They are required to furnish full reason for their decisions, and they are subject to full public scrutiny, and especially by the academic community. Any indication or suspicion of partiality will attract wide public consideration and discussion. The conditions of service of judges must be free from political manipulation. Judges' salaries must not be subject to reduction, and the government's power of the purse must not be used to place pressure on judges. Judicial salaries can never compete with the income of successful private practitioners. The attraction of the bench is usually the quality of life and the public respect that goes with judicial office. If those are compromised, the quality of the judiciary will suffer irreparably. Let me end by saying that the judiciary is clearly the weakest branch of government. It has no power over the public purse, and it has to rely on the executive branch to implement its orders. Court orders must be scrupulously carried out, and criticism of judges by political leaders should be based on issues of principle and policy, and not directed at particular judges or courts. Of course, the effects of judgments are open to criticism, and if done constitutionally, the legislature is free to change the law. This is not an infrequent occurrence in some democracies where the rule of law is respected. That the independence of the judiciary and the legal profession lies at the heart of the rule of law and the separation of powers cannot be questioned.
So, as we go forward here, let me do two things I should have done up top, which is, one is to introduce myself. I'm Cenk Uygur. I'm the host of the Young Turks and the founder of the TYT Network, and these are all issues that we care deeply about. And this panel, I dare say, is the most relevant one out of the whole conference as we speak, given that, as Richard just alluded to, in America, in the United States of America, the president is wondering whether he should abide by the courts or not, and he's testing the water as we speak. His spokesperson yesterday said, well, it was an oral decision, and we only have to follow written decisions, not oral decisions. A completely nonsensical, fabricated law that does not actually exist. So that is where we are in, well, what we used to think was the leader of democracy and the free world. Now I'm going to go to Jeffrey Robertson. He's the founder and joint head of Doughty Street Chambers, author, barrister, and academic.
Thank you. Well, we're asked to talk about the division of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judges. I wouldn't define democracy in those terms, but it is nonetheless the case that almost every democracy has these features. Firstly, and it gets back to the three elements that I think are the most valued in democracy: representative government, represented by the ballot, by the free and fair election of representatives. Now, you can guard against that, and most countries do, by laws against election rigging. And there are a lot of them, and in some countries they are applied, in some countries not. The second principal attraction of democracy is protection for freedom of speech. That is usually done by way of the Constitution or by accumulated case law, something which is upheld by the judiciary. The third feature of democracy is the independence of judges. We may wonder about that. Reading American newspapers, it's now commonplace to indicate in reporting any political court case who appointed the judge. And that's a pretty good indication of how it will end. The best judges seem to be those appointed by President Bush in years ago when the Federalist Society was not manipulating the choice. However, Trump has appointed 20% by now of federal judges, and they generally rule in his favor. There are other countries where judges' independence is not valued. They are particularly former communist countries or communist countries where they still use the manual written by Wyszynski, who was Stalin's horror prosecutor in the show trials and then foreign minister of Russia, saying that the judge's role is to be a servant of the state. And a good way of testing whether judges are independent is to look at the conviction record of the courts. In many countries, they actually boast that they have 99% conviction. This was the case in Georgia and most of the former Soviet countries. And you have to ask yourself, I think, if the judiciary has more than 95% conviction rate, whether it's truly independent. But the two important features of judicial independence are firstly competence. A lot of judges are incompetent. I found that when I was on the United Nations panel that was selecting judges for UN judgeships, and we advertised widely, and as soon as we got the judges into The Hague, we set them a 3-hour examination, a competitive examination. They were horrified, and of course it turned out a lot of them were incompetent. They had got their associates to write their judgments. So it's a good way of weeding out incompetence. But the other, of course, is the judge who is subject to dictation by the political party, is in fact a loyal servant of the government. That there are various descriptions of these called kangaroo courts, but as an Australian I don't like using that phrase of our beloved marsupial, but I don't know how it ever came to be associated with injustice. It seems quite crazy. But there are the show trial sense that so many cases when I worked in old Czechoslovakia were decided the night before by the judge receiving from the party secretary a direction as to what prison sentence would be appropriate. You can see in Russia today the extent of judicial lickspittle behavior. Perhaps the classic case is that of Navalny, who on his return after being treated in a Berlin hospital, the judge jailed him because he had failed to have a meeting with his probation officer at the time when the whole world knew he was recovering in a Berlin hospital. So you couldn't get anything more almost farcically and sadly indicative of an unindependent judge. But I don't quite agree with Richard on the question of whether you should have politicians involved in the choice of judges. That is the American way. It is not in any sense the British way, because we have an appointments committee and keep politicians well out of it. I suspect that that is best. In Australia, we have a system of appointment by the Prime Minister, who will usually put the question to his cabinet. And recently we had a 2-hour cabinet meeting over who should be appointed. There was one fellow from Western Australia and the other from New South Wales, so all the Victorian MPs were opposed to New South Wales because they got the lion's share of appointments, and the cabinet, the meeting went on and on, evenly divided, and the Prime Minister, a man named Kevin Rudd, just at the end of it threw his hands up in the air and said, "Fuck it, we take the Western Australian." So that was how the Chief Justice of Australia was appointed. Neither system is perfect, as you can see from the invigilations in the United States every time a new Supreme Court judge is appointed. So that's an open question, but nonetheless, it's the independence of the judiciary is crucial, I think, to any democracy.
All right, and good litmus test is a conviction rate, as Jeffrey just mentioned. Acquittal rate is another one. In West Bank, the IDF accused of crimes against Palestinians has an acquittal rate of over 99%. But they say, don't worry, Israel is fair and will adjudicate it fairly. Yet to be seen. All right, whether it's a democracy is for another panel. Let's go to Stephen Rapp. He's the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crime Issues, a critic of the ICC's inefficiencies, and a proponent of hybrid tribunals for greater accountability.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here at this conference and coming from this wonderful session this morning where we learned so much and had so much food for thought. You mentioned my work for President Obama as Ambassador for War Crimes Issues and ICC issues. Let make it clear, this is probably the strongest supporter of the ICC in the United States, and where Richard Goldstone and I worked together at different times at the Yugoslavia, Rwanda tribunals. And then we, of course, had the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where Jeffrey was the first president, that some of these other courts have been very, very effective, and we want the ICC to be similarly effective, and that's the real demand for international justice. Today, however, we're talking about this issue of separation of powers really in individual countries. And, in America, at least classically on paper, we have a division between the legislative and the executive and the judicial powers. Sort of a Montesquieu kind of principle. Not every country, not every democracy has the same thing. I mean, in the UK, it really is parliamentary control, both of the executive and of parliament. If there's a majority, the prime minister prevails, if the prime minister wants to go that far. And the courts have some power, but it's more limited. And in many places, we have some protections for the rights of the minorities. But frankly, what the systems everywhere requires is a civic virtue by those that we elect, which are really held to account in terms of the restraint on powers, on the protection of minorities. I mean, one of the founding fathers referred to what was in our own Constitution as parchment barriers, and we see the effect of the president ignoring either oral or what may be eventually written on parchment, and who enforces the law. I wanted to talk about something rather specific. My experience before being ambassador at large was as a prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal, and then as chief prosecutor at the Sierra Leone court. Before that, I was the United States attorney in the United States, a position appointed by the president on the recommendation of senators, a very political kind of appointment. Generally, in principle, though, successful lawyers of the president's party being put into these positions. But they're positions of enormous power, as is the position of the prosecutor. And in that regard, I wanted to bring up one of my heroes, and of all of us that have done international court and international cases, view Robert Jackson, the Supreme Court Justice from the United States, who led the U.S. team in the prosecution of the Nazis in the big trial at Nuremberg. Before he was that, he had been several positions in the U.S. government, including Attorney General, and then was on our Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, he was famous for the Korematsu dissent, the decision that President Roosevelt, his former boss as Attorney General, made to intern Japanese Americans. He dissented from that. Later on, his best friend was Harry Truman. He ruled against Harry Truman on the illegal seizure of the steel mill. So he was someone very, very willing to uphold the rule of law. But one of the greatest speeches he gave was in 1940 when he was Attorney General to United States attorneys. And there's a lot of quotes from it that emerge as in everything that Robert Jackson did. But one of those, of course, was that the United States wins its case, even when there's an acquittal, if justice is done. Another is that, there will be times when, angry majorities will demand the scalp of one or another. And we look upon the prosecutor not to follow those kinds of directions. And in terms of being a prosecutor, one must be, it's sort of a Rawls kind of notion, that you must see yourself as someone who faces the power of a prosecutor. And what would you want to face under those circumstances but someone who is dispassionate, reasonable, and just? So in a system like we have, U.S. attorneys are politically appointed. Attorney General is appointed by the president, has been the president's brother, been the president's campaign manager, is very involved in politics. But there's been a principle, actually in the Principles of Prosecution, in the U.S. Attorney's Manual, which you can read on the web, about how one exercises restraint, how one operates without fear and favor, how one doesn't use this enormous power to oppress, to weaponize, etc. And what we sadly have now, that regulation, that book, really, frankly, thrown out the window. Now we go after our political enemies. Now my friend Evgeny Vindman, I don't know if you remember, he's the brother of Alexander Vindman. They were both working on the National Security Council, Ukrainian Americans. He worked closely with him in Ukraine on the Advisory Committee on Atrocity Crimes. He decided rather boldly to go back to Richmond, Virginia and run for Congress and got elected. And now the U.S. Attorney, the acting U.S. Attorney in Washington is threatening to prosecute him for the treason of supporting Ukraine when he was in this, when he was working for the U.S. government. That's the kind of weaponization. But there's the other aspect of it. I mean, U.S. attorneys don't prosecute every case. I mean, I prosecuted one tax case every year, around tax deadline. I found the worst tax offender. We prosecuted him. It sent a clear message. File your taxes. Be honest, etc. Other situations you prosecute in other strategic ways. And it's appropriate that administrations establish priorities and say we're going to provide more investigative resources for healthcare fraud or environmental crime, or perhaps when one party is in on national security issues. But you don't decide what cases prosecutors are going to do. And you enforce the law that needs, and you don't tell prosecutors, don't touch it. And one of the most tragic things that's happened now, even while we see all sorts of corrupt and violent individuals receive pardons, comes to us from the kings of England that somehow presidents, heads of state can let people off no matter how heinous the crimes. I guess we have to live with that. But when we deal with, for instance, our own, was controversial initially, our federal, our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, a law the United States passed 25 or 30 years ago, in which it was a crime for a company to bribe a foreign leader. And as a result of this, there's been active prosecution, sometimes very famous corporations, Siemens Company here in Germany, et cetera, prosecuted for making bribes. But it's worked. Now, people are afraid of it. They're not bribing. I was just in Kenya last week, and I talked to a leading businessman who's busy working on a number of public projects for the Kenyan government, building new cities, a variety of things like that, very remunerative. And he describes being shaken down constantly. Where's my bribe? Where's my cutback? Where's my kickback, et cetera? And he's even had to expose these individuals. But generally, his answer is, look, I can't do that. I'll be in jail. Well, you know what Trump did the other day, and Attorney General Bondi has announced, we will no longer prosecute these cases. So now he says they're lining up. Hey, you're not going to get prosecuted. You need to pay off. So we, instead of being the leading exporter or enabler of democracy, we become the enabler of corruption. Fundamentally, it's a matter, however, of having systems and having a public that demands that those who hold these powers live up to the standards of federal prosecution, live up to the standards of restraint, dispassion, of reasonableness, of justice. And that's what we have to demand as citizens in every country, in every way that we can. We can't rely on the parchment. It falls to us.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation, which we're going to have in 1 minute. We're going to have one more keynote speaker, and then we'll open it up. To the point that was just made, Sheldon Adelson was Donald Trump's largest donor in 2016. In America, you can donate as much money as you want to a campaign. He was up on Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It was dismissed once Trump won with a minuscule fine. So I think that Trump got tired of dismissing all the cases for all of his donors. So he just decided, I'll just dismiss the law entirely. So go ahead and be as corrupt as you like in other countries. Why not? It's open season. So, but in America, and what we'll discuss about it in the panel, does it really matter if it's judges getting elected, when I would argue that it does, or if a politician is appointing him, because the politician takes so much, well, now legalized bribes through campaign contributions. So those are enormously important questions as well, especially in the American context where there's nearly open bribery, legalized bribery, thanks to the Supreme Court, which is another conversation I hope to have. But first, we're going to go to András Baka. He's the former head of Hungary's Supreme Court, for that perspective.
Thank you very much. Well, just to answer immediately to your question, I think it's very important that the judges should be appointed by independent bodies or independent colleagues, bodies of colleagues, and bodies of judges, and rather than appointed by politicians. But of course, there is a counterexample, and I would like to quote the famous American judge Antonin Scalia, and he said that what sets the United States apart from other countries, not the Bill of Rights, which every banana republic has, but the separation of powers. Americans should learn to love the gridlock. In his view, without the separation of powers, there is no good legislation or law. And he was one of the most conservative judges, and he served the US Supreme Court for 30 years. So if a judge is really a judge, he not follows the party lines. He follows the lines of the profession, and the profession says that he insisted on maintaining the separation of powers, and I think this message is very valid today. And however, he was a conservative judge. And in certain questions he expressed very conservative views. Well, but he teaches us how important the separation of powers are, and of course we know exactly in theory how to protect the division of powers. And in theory, of course, there are plenty of ways to protect division of powers. But when when it happens in the reality, it's very difficult. And I'm not absolutely, as a Hungarian, I'm not absolutely qualified to say and to give you advice how to protect a division of powers, because we lost that. We lost the division of powers. In Hungary, there is a systematic dismantling of the separation of powers. I think the executive takes over everything. Well, let's. Normally, it starts with the judiciary. One of the clashes immediately is the judiciary. In Hungary, well, they took over the media first, but after the judiciary came. And just to give you an example, the retirement age of the judges in Hungary was 70 years old. It was a 140 years tradition. 70, and this is about the average of the retirement age of the judges in Europe, and I think it's even more in England, in Britain. But 70 years was about the average, and the Hungarian parliament, where the ruling party has 2/3 majority, within 8 days they reduced this 70 years of retirement age to 62, which was the lowest in Europe. And what they did immediately filled up the vacant positions with other judges, and well, this was the end of any division of powers. But of course, they made the parliament to be a kind of button-pressing machine. They used emergency law. Since 2020, they are using not the parliament, but using an emergency law. Emergency law means that the government governs with decrees instead of parliamentary decisions. So during the last 5 years, we had no real parliament. We had government decrees, and the reason for that was the pandemic first, and secondly, it is the war in Ukraine, and none of the other countries introduce any kind of similar kind of thing. So the problem is when we our title today is how to protect the division of powers as the foundation of democracy. My question is how to protect the division of powers, how to re-establish the division of powers when you have lost. And I think in America, and of course that was the case in Poland, and I could mention other countries. I think it is important. In America, it is just the beginning. There are frightening signs what's happening there and what's going on, but it seems to me that there are dangerous steps forward or toward to disrupt the division of powers, which worked well for hundreds of years in America, for 200 years in America, and of course they attacking the judiciary. There are problems with the universities. We expelled the Central European University from Hungary to go to Vienna. We expelled them. So it's against academic freedom. And so it is a frightening situation in which we are now. Well, I was a member of the European Court of Human Rights for 17 years, and we had several judgments, especially during the last 20 years, dealing with freedom of the judges, free speech of judges, and independence of the judiciary. And we said several times that independence of the judiciary is a condition to the separation of powers, which is an important element of democracy. So this is what is on stake today, and I think taking into account the erosion of this division of powers in several states and several countries, I think it's a frightening sign, and we have to find solution. I would say there are individual solutions. I mean, what Hungary and what the United States and Poland and several other countries should do, but of course at the same time we have to be prepared to work out a common way of thinking to fight against this kind of erosion and a disruption of division of powers. Thank you very much.
Great. So that's actually what I want to pick up on right in the beginning. We do have two other panelists. Yavuz Aydin is a Turkish judge living in exile. He has a very interesting story that I'd like him to share in a minute. And Hina Jalani, she's a renowned Pakistani human rights lawyer. I want to do a round of quick questions before we get to the specific stories of the panelists as well. If the executive says, I'm not listening to the courts anymore, does anyone on this panel think there's anything the judiciary can do about it?
Contempt of court. Contempt of court.
Right, and then when they don't listen to that?
Classic.
So does that come with any degree of power? So you do contempt of court, of course.
Yeah, the court has its own power, usually the local police, who can arrest the politician. It happened once in Britain about 15 years ago when the Home Secretary refused an order of the court and was dealt with for the criminal charge of contempt. It didn't go very far, but it went far enough to establish contempt of court as a crime that can be used against the abusers of executive power.
I'm picturing the Supreme Court sending someone to arrest President Trump. And that is not a picture that exists in my mind. but that, yes, that's one power.
Good to hear, yes. Ultimately, it's up to the people and the electorate to respect the Constitution and respect the independence of judges. I mean, an interesting example in South Africa involved the International Criminal Court warrant of arrest against al-Bashir. He was, notwithstanding that, the government, then President Zuma, invited him to attend an AU head of states meeting in South Africa. He arrived, a civil society organization went to court to get an order that he be arrested. And it's interesting that rather than disobey the court, the government lied to the court. I mean, it was first of the two prizes. It lied to the court rather than disobey the order, and they bundled al-Bashir out of the country and then went to court and said, well, it's too late to make the order because he's gone. But since then, in the last few weeks, our government's made it clear that when the G20 meets in South Africa in November, President Putin will not be invited because he's been informed that they'll have to arrest him. So I mean, but if there was a general, I mean, if you would have had an opinion poll on the al-Bashir, I think the majority of South Africans would have been on al-Bashir's side. But the government didn't want to be seen to be bucking an order of court. The Constitution is respected, and the government didn't want to get on the wrong side of it. So, I mean, it's very difficult to draw lessons from it, but certainly that I think is a cardinal issue.
Yeah. So, Yavuz, you were involved in a situation where that question was real. And so tell us about what happened in Turkey under Erdogan, and,
Yeah.
and what was the reaction?
Yeah. As an answer to your previous question, I will deviate from Mr. Baka's approach with due respect. He said he's Hungarian and he's not qualified to talk about rule of law and democracy here because they lost the separation of powers in Hungary. But I think, sorry, but I think, no, that's what I understood. But what I think is that you and I are the most qualified people to talk about this. I firmly believe this because I lived by living. While I was a judge, I became a terrorist. I went to bed a judge and woke up a terrorist, like in the Kafka's Metamorphosis. It's like that. Overnight. And I was not alone. I was, along with me, more than 4,000 judges and prosecutors were declared terrorists. Can you believe this? Those, among the audience, those who are young in age, maybe they couldn't follow, or maybe since this situation in Turkey is now normalized for the sake of geopolitics or real politics now, Turkey was not like this before. Turkey in 2010 to 2011 was taken seriously when talking about accession to the EU, and Turkey was the model country for Arab Spring to show that a Muslim population can live together with democracy, and there can be separation of powers, and there can be rule of law and democracy in a country located in this Middle East, the eastern point of West and western point of East, but there Turkey is. So based on this experience, I think that we should have talked more, even more, because we saw all these steps. Now the United States, Italy, Romania, Hungary are going through. We saw this movie almost 10 years ago. And we know what will happen next in each and every country. Believe me, I know it. I told it to Polish friends like 8 years ago from now. They couldn't believe. I said, believe me, Duda and Kaczynski will take over the media now. They will send the tax officers to media outlets and others, and he will take over them. Then he will run a campaign to bash and to crucify the judges, and they will declare the judges as the enemies of public. So it's all the same everywhere. Not in this century. In the previous century also it was like this. These guys have a playbook. They are making use of the previous experiences. The fault is that we are not making use of their experiences and the experiences of those who were subject to these atrocities, this persecution before us. So now my position is something like trying to tell you that please do not take it granted. Democracy is not a given. Rule of law is not a given. It can be taken from you overnight. We saw it in the United States. Nobody would think this way. Yeah? We are seeing this. We are witnessing another situation. We were talking about Hungary and Poland 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and now we started to talk about Italy. Italy became the worst country in terms of rule of law in the EU now. In some weeks, in some months now. So who would imagine this? But this will happen. And the danger is at the doorstep, maybe in the Netherlands, maybe in Belgium where I live. So please, the answer to your question is that judges cannot maybe do something real to prevent such a thing when the executive goes rogue and they do not listen to the courts. But media, civil society, a vivid civil society, a resilient civil society, and academia it's a game, a team game, and people can prevent this from happening. This prophecy is not meant to realize itself. You can stop it. That's what I can say.
Yep. As a person who runs a media company in America, that warning is problematic. So we'll see how that goes. All right, I want to ask another important general question to the entire panel, which is when the judiciary is lost and the separation of powers is lost, is democracy lost? And so, you know, we've already had that happen to some degree in Hungary and Turkey. So does that mean Hungary and Turkey are not actual democracies? Or can you maintain some semblance of a democracy without an independent judiciary?
I think South Asia is a prime example of what's happening, but also these are trends that you can see all over the world today. It's a global trend that's much worrying for many people, especially lawyers and human rights defenders. You know, there are more and more countries in the world that have now constitutions that spell out democracy, make arrangements for the implementation of democratic values, set up institutions, and yet in practices there is no progress in terms of these countries being able to respect and their institutions being able to implement the constitutional guidelines and the limitations on authority in order to make sure that democracy prevails. Why is that? And I think one of the contributors to this lack of transition, you know, these are countries that are perpetually trapped in this transition, perpetually, and have been for decades now taking this justification that we are in transition and we are setting up our institutions. But those institutions never get to a state where those institutions respect the roles that the constitutions give them. So let me say this, that while constitutions do spell out what is required and the roles that are required of institutions and the different organs of the state, the lack of restraint and the temptation and the tendency to encroach on the domain of other organs of the state weakens that system of checks and balances, which results very much in the loss of freedoms of the people at large, because that's the system we start depending on to make sure that where one organ of the state is transcending its authority, the other will step in to check that. And much of that, I hope I'm not taking too much time in answer to your question, but this will also lead me into what I was going to say when you asked me about my own experiences. I think much of this is happening because every institution now has succumbed to populist rhetoric and the desire to become popular. And unfortunately, in my country and many countries of South Asia, the judiciaries have also succumbed to that temptation. So the judicial pronouncements now are not necessarily implementing their role as interpretations of the Constitution with integrity and with the honest intention of making sure that the spirit of the Constitution and the role that the judiciary has in order to interpret constitutional provisions with more integrity is now being affected. So that leads to impunity, not just for in terms of accountability of the judiciary, but accountability of all organs of the state, including the executive, and also even local leaderships that we have who do not respect the roles. In my country, for instance, we are now, as human rights defenders and as human rights lawyers, very, very worried about what we are going to do now in this scenario where we have a parliament that surrenders to executive authority, a judiciary that is not just independent but lacks the courage and the ability to retain its independence. So they surrender their independence. We have an executive topped by the military leadership who have, of course, sustained their control over every aspect of decision making in that country. This has destroyed the ability of the organized civil society and public opinion to put some pressure on these institutions to play their role. So we have a bad opposition. We have an opposition that is irresponsible, lacks vigilance and any desire for vigilance, and we have a government that has totally surrendered to extraneous actors, be they religious or military.
It's interesting and frightening to see the similarities between all the different countries as the Democratic Party seems to be surrendering to Donald Trump, and he's having his way with the entire system. On the other hand, there's also amazing differences because our Supreme Court doesn't mind being unpopular at all. So maybe that'll be an ironic advantage for us because Citizens United case, for example, has barely 10% popularity. It basically legalized bribery in America. Everyone in the country despises it. And the Supreme Court passed it and says it's okay every time. And Roe versus Wade was overturned. That's about only 30% popularity. But the Supreme Court constantly does things that are terribly unpopular on behalf of an agenda they have, which is a different conversation. And I would love to get to, but I'm not sure we're going to. But let's stay on this because I know a lot of people wanted to comment on it. If you don't have an independent judiciary, do you still have a democracy? I think you wanted to weigh in.
Well, if you don't have an independent judiciary, you don't have a democracy. I think this is my answer, clear answer. If you take a look at the recent developments, when several countries slide into the authoritarianism and building up authoritarian regime, it seems to me that sometimes the judiciary is the last resort which resists. This happened in Poland, and this happens in Hungary too. In Poland, I think in 2016, I think there was a huge demonstration where 1,300 judges collected and demonstrated against the government. And there was another demonstration in 2020 when tens of thousands of people were demonstrated for the independence of the judiciary, and it is in Hungary. In Hungary, I don't want to be misunderstood. The Hungary, on the level of the judges are independent, with a couple of exceptions, of a couple of judges, but the overwhelming majority of the judges, they can act independently without any outside influence. The problem is that the system is not independent. The system is fighting for the independency, fighting the everyday independency, because we cannot prevent when the parliament say that we are limiting the retirement age of the judges. We are the judges cannot resist that if a new Supreme Court president is elected, who openly denies the rule of law, who openly denies the separation of powers and all kind of democratic principles and elements. We cannot prevent that. But we nevertheless, we're still fighting, and the judiciary is still fighting. There was a demonstration a couple of weeks ago, a mass demonstration with 5,000 people, including a lot of judges, against the influence of the government. So the judiciary is sometimes the last resort against this process to slide into the authoritarianism.
There's no support to judges internationally,
well,
as I understand it.
That
is the
to
problem.
the extent
No-
we expect.
No support. To be a judge, it's not popular. If you have two parties in front of you, before you, I mean, one is winning, the other one is not winning. but it is possible that even the one who is winning is not satisfied. So it's not a popular profession.
Well, there's no support from the United Nations. There's nothing.
But there is the European Court of Human Rights.
Of course.
It takes a lot of time. It takes an awful lot of time to finish a case.
Yes.
But nevertheless, the court decided several times in favor of the judges and protected the judges, and even reinstituted the dismissed judges to the Supreme Court and to their previous position, which is very exceptional to make this kind of consequential judgments.
But in fact, one advantage of this concept of the secure World Security Council, although it won't be the world, that it will support the independence of the judiciary as something that is fundamental to democracy.
And I think that raises the important question of, where the international community is in all of this, and the power that we can provide, and accountability, at least in this case, in the European continent and within the Council of Europe, is in a human rights court. Obviously, we're not talking about things that are the kind of attacks on judges, unless they become physical or violent, that can take us to international crimes, but they're often the harbinger of it. And I note that, in the U.S. and the EU and Canada, Australia, other countries have adopted the Magnitsky sanctions, under which foreign officials, can be sanctioned for these kinds of attacks on democracy and this kind of corruption of systems, and those are effective. And we, listen to Maria Ressa, who is facing these criminal libel cases, and some of which were going to be unbailable, where she was going to go to court, and go to jail, where the international community spoke out, and there was defense of her, and it became really impossible for the government to do the bad things that they were going to do, and then in the end we have international justice, and in a situation where it all came together, where somebody who opposed the whole system of rule of law is now in the dock, facing his victims in a trial. We begin, we hope, relatively soon. But I do think that the system of the international community, the reason that we're all convened here, is the ways in which we can support each other, and we in America now need your support. To be frank, but I mean, for these essential principles, I will say, just on the question, I mean, we have our neighbor, Mexico recently, if you've been down there, the week they passed the constitutional amendment that essentially provided for elective judges and fired their whole independent judiciary, and is now going to elections. And of course, we like what President Sheinbaum is saying against President Trump, but she's not. She's going right into this whole business of essentially neutering the judiciary. But those of us that are engaged are now working with the electorate and with civil society in Mexico to try to elect judges who will be independent, to band together, whatever the structure is, to save these kinds of values. And it's what we all have to do together.
Yeah, so we only have a minute left. I want to go to Yo's because I know he's got a pertinent thing on this topic. I will say, I mean, it is extraordinary here that, we've got someone from America, or maybe two people from America, saying we might need the rest of the world's help soon.
Sanction us.
Right. So we're in an amazing inflection point in history here. So, and I'm going to summarize with one last thing, but first, Yavuz.
About this democracy without rule of law, they call it illiberal democracy, which is not a real term, actually, because Cohen Lynette, the president of the European Court of Justice, the EU's court, he says there's no such thing as illiberal democracy. It's not him for the first time saying this. A Spanish scholar, a Portuguese scholar in the 90s had already scrutinized this, but in a nutshell, this becomes autocracy, but electoral autocracy, competitive autocracy, or autocratic legalism, whatever you call. So we shouldn't give the credit, we shouldn't, give the credibility to these autocrats to call them even with the illiberal illiberal democrat. They are autocrats, and they are turning the countries into autocratic legalism or competitive legalism, whatever you call it. But this is, let's not soften it. It's not illiberal democracy, and unfortunately, with the U.S. leading this, Trump leading this tendency, unfortunately, we will be more talking about security. And when you just imagine the pyramid of this needs, you know, security comes first after food and water and air. So when we will be talking about security more and more, we will be talking about justice and rule of law less and less. Unfortunately, this is the, I think, this is the danger ahead of us. And for that, we need to be really vigilant and resilient. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I guess, I don't know if I'm happy or sad to learn a new phrase, competitive autocracy. And I'm afraid that that applies to a lot of nations these days. Yeah. What an amazing panel. I wish we could sit here for hours. I had at least 10, 12 more questions for you all, and especially because of how pertinent it is today. But I think my main takeaway from their expertise here, which is amazing collection of people, is that when they come for a different part of society, whether it's media or the courts or any other institution in your government or your society, you have to fight at the first stage. Because if you wait for the third stage, it's already too late. So people must coalesce quicker, earlier, better, more efficiently. Otherwise, we see some of the examples of what can go wrong here. All right, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for speaking and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.